Did they capture human children? The Alien General Falters. Part 1. The Prize of War. The Vreth warships came out of faster-than-light travel in complete silence. 5 massive gray vessels materializing from nothing, arranged in a sharp formation, cutting through the dark like the edge of a blade aimed directly at Helix Station. General Ka-Reth stood at the front viewport of his command ship and watched the outpost grow larger against the field of stars. And it was a Terran Coalition research and logistics hub, a wide ring-shaped structure with glowing blue docking ports and a long central spine running through its middle like the backbone of some great ocean creature drifting in the void. The station's outer lights pulsed in slow, steady rhythms. It had the look of something alive and completely unaware, going about its business with no idea that 5 warships had just appeared at its edge. Ka-Reth had studied Helix Station for months. Then he knew its weapon systems, its crew numbers, its patrol schedules, and every weak point in its construction. He knew that its shields could handle a standard attack from one direction, but would buckle badly when pressured from multiple angles at once. He knew that its emergency communication array was housed on the outer ring, which would be the first section his boarding teams would reach. He knew the layout of its corridors, the positions of its security stations, and the precise sequence in which its automated defenses would respond to a threat. To him, Helix Station was not a fortress. It was a puzzle he had already solved. "All wings, begin approach," he said into his comm unit, and his voice was flat and perfectly calm, the way it always was before a fight. The Vreth were one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in the known galaxy. They had been building warships long before humans had discovered how to forge metal. Their skin was thick gray-green, their pale eyes were adapted to near-total darkness, and they stood close to 2.5 meters tall. They did not feel fear the way most species did. They had spent generations replacing fear with cold calculation and absolute discipline. They also believed with complete certainty that humans were an inferior species. Not in a cruel or passionate way, the Vreth did not waste energy on passion. They believed it the way a scientist believes in a proven result. Humans were too emotional, too chaotic, too attached to each other to make clean decisions under pressure. They were a young species, clever enough, brave enough, but ultimately too driven by feeling rather than logic to last long against a civilization as old and as measured as the Vreth. The war had started 6 years ago over a narrow stretch of space near the Terran outer colonies. The Vreth had projected it would last 6 months, that humans would absorb 2 or 3 hard defeats, recognize the futility of continued resistance, and negotiate terms that gave Vreth interests control of the disputed region. Humans had not done this. They had fought back with increasing intensity every single year. They had adapted their tactics in ways that defied every projection. They had traded space for time, and time for preparation, and preparation for costly counterattacks that no Vreth planner had fully accounted for. They had lost engagements that should have broken them and then appeared 6 weeks later with a completely different approach. 6 years later, the war was still going, expensive, slow, and producing no clear winner. Ka-Reth had spent 2 years designing the answer to this problem. He was not here to win a battle today. He was here to end the war entirely, cleanly, on Vreth terms, without risking a single major fleet engagement. The plan was simple, elegant, and had no failure condition that his most experienced planners could identify. "Begin jamming their communications," he ordered. "No signal leaves this station." The 5 warships moved in from 5 directions simultaneously, surrounding the ring-shaped station before its crew had time to organize any coherent response. The station's defense guns fired, bright orange energy bursts punching out in every direction. But the Vreth shield layers absorbed every shot without difficulty, the way a stone wall absorbs thrown pebbles. The boarding pods launched. Armored Vreth soldiers moved through Helix Station's corridors with efficient, practiced precision. They secured the docking bays first, then the power core, then the weapons control room. The Terran crew, mostly scientists, engineers, and logistics personnel, not soldiers, fought where they could, but they were outgunned and surrounded, and they understood what the outcome was going to be. Within 2 hours, the station commander sent a request for terms. Ka-Reth accepted without any expression on his face. The operation had gone exactly as planned. Then Sub-Commander Vale appeared at his side, holding a datapad in both hands with the particular careful posture of someone delivering news they did not know how to frame. Vale was younger than Ka-Reth by nearly 30 years, a capable officer who had an unfortunate habit of showing doubt at exactly the wrong moments. "General," he said, choosing his words with visible care, "the boarding teams have found something in the lower decks of the station, something our intelligence files did not account for." Ka-Reth turned. "Show me!" Vale raised the datapad. The screen showed a brightly lit room on the lower level of the station, a room with colorful panels on the walls and small chairs and round tables covered in learning materials, models of star systems, and hand-drawn diagrams of spacecraft. The far wall had a long painted mural showing a row of planets in different colors stretching from one end to the other. And gathered in the far corner of that room, pressed together in a close group, were 47 small humans. And they were children, ranging from approximately 6 years old at the youngest to about 15 at the oldest. They wore matching gray and blue uniforms with a small golden star sewn onto the chest. Some of the smallest ones had been crying. Ka-Reth could see the dried tracks on their faces. A few were holding the hands of the children next to them, but most of them were not crying right now. Most of them were looking directly at the camera with wide, quiet, completely steady eyes. "What is this?" Ka-Reth asked. "A youth education program, sir," Vale said. "The Terran Coalition operates mobile academies for the children of deep space personnel, children whose parents are stationed too far from inhabited worlds for standard schooling. The program travels with the station. The children receive training in science, navigation, engineering, and other technical fields." He paused for just a moment. "There are 47 of them, sir." "The youngest is 6 years old." Ka-Reth studied the screen in silence. His first brief instinct was to send them away, to load them onto a rescue pod and return them to Terran space before they became a complication. They were children. They were irrelevant to the war. But the other part of his mind, the cold, calculating part that had built his entire career, had already begun to move. Children were not irrelevant. Children were the single most powerful pressure point in any civilization in the galaxy, human, Vreth, or otherwise. No government, however strong, could look at the faces of its own children in enemy hands and remain fully rational. The emotional weight of it was too heavy. Even the most disciplined leadership would feel the pull, and humans of all species felt that pull the most. "Take them," Ka-Reth said. Vale's head came up sharply. "Or, sir." "Carefully and without harm." Ka-Reth kept his voice level. "They will be transported to Cage Station Omicron and held there under proper conditions. When the Terran Coalition receives confirmation that we hold 47 of their children, they will come to the negotiating table immediately, and they will accept terms they would never accept otherwise. Because the alternative is those children spending another day in Vreth hands." Vale was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. "Sir," he said at last, "they are children." "They are the end of this war, Sub-Commander," Ka-Reth replied, and turned back to the viewport. "Prepare the fleet for jump." Vale took the datapad and walked away without another word. The expression on his face was the specific kind that soldiers wore when following orders they believed were wrong. Ka-Reth did not watch him go. He turned back to the viewport, to the stars, to the vast dark that he intended to own before this month was finished. He had 47 small, frightened humans in his custody and a perfectly designed plan to use them. He was certain, completely, absolutely, without a single shadow of doubt, that this was the move that would end the 6-year war within weeks. He had no idea, not the smallest flicker of suspicion, that those 47 children were about to become the greatest mistake of his entire military career. Did they capture human children? The alien General falters. Part 2. What Fear Looks Like. On both sides. The first thing the Vreth guards expected from the children was fear. They expected crying and pleading and the kind of desperate helplessness that made prisoners easy to manage. This was what the Vreth understood about captivity, that it broke people down, made them quiet and compliant, and focused entirely on the hope of being released. It was how captivity worked for every species they had ever held. It was what captivity was for. What they got instead was something that none of their training had prepared them for. Within the first hour of arriving at Cage Station Omicron, the children had moved every bench in the common area to the wall on the left side. And within 3 hours, they had sorted themselves into groups, the youngest children in the center, the older ones arranged around the outside in a loose protective ring. By the end of the first full day, they had a leader. Her name was Mara Osei, and she was 14 years old. She had not asked to be the leader. She had simply started doing things that needed doing, calming the youngest children, assigning the older ones to tasks, and figuring out what resources they had and what they needed. And everyone else had followed her, the way people naturally follow the person who looks like they know what to do next. Mara was tall for her age, with close-cut hair and watchful eyes that moved constantly, taking in everything. Her mother was Admiral Yara Osei of the Terran Coalition Fleet, and Mara had grown up on warships and deep space stations. Now she had spent her entire life in closed metal environments, surrounded by people who solved problems as a matter of daily routine. She understood systems, how things worked, what they needed, and where they were vulnerable. She stood in the center of the common room on the first day and addressed the group in a voice that was quiet and firm and did not waver. "We are not going to panic," she said. "Panic does not help us. A panic uses energy and time that we need for other things." She looked around at all of them, making eye contact with the youngest ones especially. "We are going to stay calm. We are going to pay attention to everything around us, and we are going to figure out our situation. That is the job right now. Does everyone understand?" Most of them nodded. A 7-year-old named Pip raised his hand and asked very seriously if they were going to be okay. Mara looked at him directly and said yes, but only if they stayed smart. Pip nodded and did not ask again. Over the next 2 days, Mara organized the older children into observation shifts. While some slept, others lay flat near the door and watched the pattern of guard footsteps through the small gap at the bottom. And 2 15-year-old twins named Sarah and Davo, who had been studying structural engineering as part of the academy program, were put to work examining every surface in all 3 rooms: the walls, the ventilation grills, the joints between ceiling panels, and the seams around the door frame. "We are not trying to escape yet," Mara told Davo when he asked the obvious question. "We are mapping. We are understanding this place completely before we do anything else." She pulled out the first of what would eventually become dozens of food wrapper maps and began sketching the room from memory. "You do not run until you know exactly where you are running to." Neither twin had any argument against this. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the corner near the meal delivery slot. Something quiet and completely unplanned that would turn out to be one of the most important developments of the entire situation. Tomas was talking to the guards. He was 10 years old, with a round face and an expression of relentless, cheerful curiosity that he appeared to have no ability to turn off. He had started sitting near the meal slot during delivery times and just talking, not demanding anything. I'm not asking to be released, just talking in the friendly, wandering way of a person who found everything genuinely interesting. He told the guards about his pet cat, Biscuit, who weighed 4 kilograms and could open refrigerator doors and once ate an entire birthday cake belonging to Tomas's little sister. He described the view from his bedroom window on Earth, a wide green valley with a river running through it that turned silver in the morning light. He talked about his favorite teacher at the academy, a tall man named Professor Cass, who knew 17 languages and could solve navigation calculations in his head without writing anything down. The Vreth guards understood perhaps 1 word in 3 through their translator devices. But Tomas was quick and observant, and he noticed something interesting. Every time he accidentally repeated a Vreth word back at them, catching it from their conversations, guessing at its meaning from the context around it, the guards reacted with unmistakable surprise. They were not used to a human learning their language. It had apparently not occurred to them that a child might try. So Tomas decided to try. He started keeping lists on the backs of food wrapper paper, using a small piece of plastic he had pulled from a loose bench joint as a writing tool. He began with simple words: door, food, water, guard, yes, no. And he worked his way up to harder ones: station, outside, time, move, open. He practiced pronunciations quietly to himself during the long stretches between meals, testing sounds against his careful memory of what the guards' mouths did when they spoke. On the 3rd day, he said, "Good morning" in Vreth with the correct guttural sound on the 2nd syllable, and the guard who arrived with breakfast stopped so suddenly that the meal tray rattled in his large gray-green hands. The guard stared at Tomas for several long seconds. Then he slid 2 extra portions through the slot before he left. Tomas shared them with Pip, who declared with complete seriousness that Tomas was the best person currently living on the station, a title Tomas accepted with a modest shrug. The guard, whom Tomas had privately named Grumble because of the sound his translator device made when it struggled with long sentences, began arriving slightly early for his shifts after that. And he never said anything remarkable. He just seemed to find reasons to be near the slot when Tomas was nearby. Back on the Vreth command ship, Ka-Reth sent his message to the Terran Coalition on day 4. It was a precise and professional communication. No dramatics, no raised voices, no displays of anger or cruelty. He confirmed that 47 young Terran citizens were currently in the care of the Vreth military at a secure and undisclosed location. He provided medical verification that all 47 were unharmed and in good health. And he laid out his terms in clear, direct language. The coalition would withdraw from the disputed border corridor, accept Vreth administrative authority over 3 outer colony sectors, and reduce their fleet size to pre-war numbers within 18 months. In return, all 47 children would be released immediately and returned safely to their families. He gave them 6 hours to respond. And he expected an answer in 5. Emotional, urgent, already reaching toward agreement. The 6 hours passed. Nothing came. Then, at exactly the 6-hour mark, a single transmission arrived from Terran Coalition Command. The sender was Admiral Yara Ose, and when Ka-Reth opened the message, her voice filled the command deck, measured, professional, and completely without the panic he had been counting on. "General Ka-Reth," she said, we have received your terms, and we have noted your demands. Before you send your next communication, we suggest you review the attached file." The attached file was a complete structural blueprint of Cage Station Omicron. Every level was shown. Every corridor, every room, every system, every access point. The measurements were precise down to the last meter. The document had clearly come from intelligence sources of considerable quality and considerable reach, and there was no demand attached to it, no threat, no ultimatum. It was simply a piece of information placed in front of Ka-Reth with deliberate, perfect calm, the way a skilled player sets down a single piece on a game board and then sits back and waits. What it communicated, without a single additional word, was entirely clear. We already know exactly where our children are. Ka-Reth sat with the schematic filling his screen for a long time. Well, then the comfortable certainty he had carried since the raid on Helix Station felt, for the first time, like it had a small but very definite crack running straight through the middle of it. Did they capture human children? The alien General falters. Part 3. The General begins to falter. Ka-Reth did not change his position. He had built his career on refusing to be rattled by unexpected information, and he was not going to abandon that discipline now over a schematic file. Now, of course, the Coalition had intelligence on Vreth stations. They were at war. Intelligence gathering was what opposing militaries did. Their knowing the location of Omicron changed nothing about the fundamental reality of the situation. He held the children. They did not. The leverage was still entirely on his side. He spent the next morning issuing new orders. The guard complement at Cage Station Omicron was doubled. His sensor sweeps of the surrounding space were increased from every 4 hours to every 2. All communications in and out of the station were restricted to command-encrypted channels. The children's common area was to be checked visually every 30 minutes, day and night. His staff carried out every instruction without question. And then the reports started coming in. The first arrived on day 5. A guard supervisor named Helk sent a short, carefully worded report, noting that 3 soldiers from the cell block rotation had been spending their off-duty hours in the corridor outside the children's holding area. Not while on duty, just sitting nearby during their free time, doing nothing in particular. When the supervisor asked them to explain themselves, all 3 had given the same answer. The small human boy with the round face had been telling them a story about his cat, and they had wanted to hear how it ended. Ka-Reth issued an immediate order that off-duty personnel were to remain in their own quarters during rest periods. The second report arrived on day 6. A 15-year service veteran named Torvin had taken a broken piece of maintenance equipment from the station's repair bay and spent 2 hours in the corridor outside the cell block door, passing pieces of it through the meal slot and teaching a 7-year-old named Pip how to take it apart and put it back together correctly. And Torvin had apparently made this decision entirely on his own initiative and saw nothing remotely unusual about it when questioned. Ka-Reth removed Torvin from all cell block duties and issued a formal reminder to the entire Omicron garrison about maintaining appropriate professional distance from prisoners. The third report came on day 7, and this one was delivered in person by Sub-Commander Vale himself, who arrived at Ka-Reth's command room with a data pad and the expression of someone who was finding it increasingly difficult to remain diplomatically neutral. "Sir," Vale said, "4 members of the Night Guard rotation have been playing Vreth board games with the children through the meal slot opening." Ka-Reth set down the report he had been reading. "How?" "The guards brought the games themselves, sir," Vale said, with great care. They determined that keeping the children occupied would reduce noise disturbances during night cycles and make their own shift easier to manage. He paused. "The children beat them in 7 out of 8 rounds, sir. The guards are now apparently determined to win at least 1 game before their rotation ends." Ka-Reth stood very still for a moment. "Sub-Commander," he said with precise control, "are the children afraid of us?" Vale considered the question. "Not visibly." "Aye, sir," he said at last. "The youngest ones were distressed in the first few hours after arrival, but that appears to have resolved quickly." He looked at his datapad. "The behavioral reports from the guards consistently describe them as organized and calm, sir." Ka-Reth turned to the viewport. Organized and calm were not the words he had prepared for. He had prepared for frightened. He had prepared for desperate. But he had prepared for the specific kind of quiet helplessness that made leverage function the way it was supposed to function. Instead, his guards were bringing games into the corridor and losing at them, and a child was telling stories about a cat, and a decorated veteran had apparently decided to spend his afternoon teaching a 7-year-old how machinery worked. There was a feeling building at the back of Ka-Reth's mind that he did not have a precise name for, and because he had not needed to name it before in 30 years of command. It was not worry. It was not suspicion. It was something quieter than both, a small, persistent wrongness, like a sound playing just below the level where you could make out its source. "Increase patrols," he said. 2-hour sweeps become 1-hour sweeps. Full sensor coverage at all times. "Yes, sir," Vale said, and left. Inside the cell block, Mara had finished her maps. 37 food wrappers. I laid in careful sequence, showed the complete layout of everything the children could observe, the 3 connected rooms, the position of every ventilation grill, the location of the 2 external cameras she had identified by watching for their tiny indicator lights through the gap under the door, and, most importantly, the maintenance access shaft that ran along the left wall behind the ventilation panel in the far corner of the common room. The shaft was part of Cage Station Omicron's internal drone network. Every 8 hours, a small automated maintenance drone traveled through it on a fixed route to check environmental systems, moving at a steady and completely predictable pace. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for a slim adult, but Mara had 4 people in her group who were distinctly smaller than a slim adult. She was not ready to use it yet. She was still missing one critical piece of information. She did not know where the shaft led or what was at the other end. That was where Tomas came in. His Vreth vocabulary had grown substantially by day 7. He could now hold a simple back-and-forth exchange with the guards, using a combination of Vreth words and hand gestures and the kind of vivid physical acting that worked across language barriers without any translation required. The guard he privately called Grumble had become reliable about bringing extra food portions, and their conversations had graduated from descriptions of Biscuit the cat to considerably more complex topics. On Mara's instruction, Tomas spent the morning of day 8 carefully and casually working a specific question into his conversation with Grumble. Where did the little moving machines go when they came out of the wall? Grumble did not appear to find the question suspicious. He explained, in slow, simple Vreth that Tomas followed with intense and silent concentration, that the maintenance drones traveled through the service shafts from the environmental control room, completed their circuit, and then returned the same way they had come. The environmental control room was 1 level directly above them. 1 level up. Tomas thanked Grumble with enormous warmth, complimented his translator device's sound quality and what he hoped was recognizable Vreth, and went immediately to find Mara. Mara listened to his full report without expression. Then she looked at the map showing the shaft and the notation she had written next to it that said, "Level above, destination unknown," and she took out her small piece of writing plastic and crossed out unknown and wrote clearly, "Environmental control. Check for communications." She sat back and thought for a while. Then she started on a new plan. Meanwhile, on the Vreth command ship, and the intelligence summary for day 8 arrived with information that made Ka-Reth go very still at his desk. The Terran Coalition fleet had been repositioning. This alone was not alarming. Fleets moved during wartime constantly. But when his analysts mapped the full pattern of movements across the past 3 weeks, something emerged that did not fit any standard military posture. The ships were not gathering to defend Terran core systems, and they were not pulling back from the border in preparation for a negotiated settlement. They were converging, slowly from many different directions, on a specific point in deep space. That point, when mapped precisely against known coordinates, aligned with the location of Cage Station Omicron. Ka-Reth went through the analysis 3 separate times, checking every data point against the raw tracking logs. There were no errors in the mapping. And when he checked the timestamps of when the fleet movements had begun, he found something that turned the wrongness in the back of his mind into something far louder and far colder. The repositioning had started before his transmission to the Terran Coalition. Some of the ships had begun moving nearly 3 weeks before the raid on Helix Station. But the Terran fleet had been moving toward Cage Station Omicron before Ka-Reth had even decided to raid Helix Station, as though they had known what he was going to do before he had done it, or before he had even fully planned it. He stood at his viewport for a long time and said absolutely nothing. He stared at the stars and thought about plans and about assumptions, and about the specific danger of being certain you understand a situation when the situation has actually been understanding you. Then, very quietly, he turned to his communications officer. "Get me the head of Coalition Intelligence Analysis," he said. "I want to speak with them directly." And in the back of his mind, the nameless feeling that had been quietly building for days finally became something he could identify with complete, unwelcome clarity. It was not worry. It was not suspicion. It was the specific, cold sensation of understanding, far too late, that someone else had been thinking several steps further ahead than you were, and that the position you were standing in was not the one you believed you were standing in at all. Did they capture human children? The Alien General Falters. Part 4. Children of a Warrior. Species. On the morning of day 10, Mara gathered the 4 smallest children in her group and explained to them, in plain and careful language, exactly what they were going to do. She laid the food wrapper maps out on the bench between them and traced the route with one finger, pausing at each section to explain what they would find there and what they would need to do. She told each of them their specific task. She did not make the plan sound easier than it was, but she also did not make it sound harder. She described it the way her mother described difficult maneuvers to her crew, accurately, fully, and with complete confidence that the people listening were capable of carrying them out. Tomas would go first. He was the smallest in the group, and he had the most practical knowledge of Vreth words, useful if something went wrong and talking became necessary. Behind him would go a 9-year-old named Fen, who was narrow-shouldered and moved fast and quietly. Behind Fen would go 2 8-year-olds, a boy named Kale and a girl named Riss, not both small enough to move through the shaft without slowing things down. The maintenance drone completed its circuit at approximately the same time every 8 hours. Mara had been timing it for 3 days straight by pressing her palm flat against the wall and feeling the faint vibration it sent through the metal when it traveled. There was a window of just over 3 hours between the drone's outward passage and its return. More than enough time, if they moved with focus and without hesitation. "What exactly do I do when I reach the communications room?" Tomas asked. Mara showed him the paper she had prepared. It was covered in a tight, neat grid of numbers in a very specific sequence, a code that every student at the Starward Academy learned in their first year, based on the pattern from an old children's navigation puzzle that the program used to teach coordinate recognition. The code contained their precise location, and the number of children held, and their current physical status, in a format that any Terran Coalition signals officer would recognize immediately and without any ambiguity. "You find the short-range transmitter panel," Mara said. "It does not need to be active for long. 4 seconds of signal is enough for the message to transmit completely. You enter the sequence, send it, and then you come back exactly the same way you went in." Tomas studied the code. What if I cannot find the transmitter?" "You will find it," Mara said, with the tone of someone stating a known fact rather than offering encouragement. "You have spent the last 10 days studying every piece of Vreth equipment within your view through the meal slot and the door gap. You know what their hardware looks like." She looked him directly in the eye. "Tomas, you have already learned most of a working language using food wrappers and a piece of broken plastic. You can find a transmitter in a technology room." Tomas took a slow breath, thought about this, and then nodded. They moved the ventilation grill on the morning of day 11, during the 4-hour stretch when guard activity was consistently at its lowest. The grill came away from the wall cleanly. Sarah had identified on day 3 that it was held in place by only 2 interior clips, both of which opened by being pressed inward at the same time. Tomas went in first. And the shaft was dark and tight and smelled of recycled air and old metal. He moved through it on his elbows and knees, slowly and without any sound, following the direction Grumble had described. Behind him, he could hear Fenn's slow, steady breathing. Behind Fenn came Kale and Riss, moving in careful single file. The shaft bent upward at a steep angle after the first stretch, and Tomas pulled himself up it hand over hand, using the ridged edge of the duct wall for grip. His arms ached by the time he reached the flat section at the top. He stopped, listened, heard nothing moving nearby, and kept going. It took 11 minutes to reach the upper level. The access panel at the far end of the shaft opened into a narrow utility gap between 2 walls, a space just wide enough to stand in sideways, lined with conduit cables and environmental monitoring sensors. Ahead of him, through a half-open door, was a room full of equipment. Now Tomas looked through the gap in the doorway and took in everything he could see. The room had 3 walls of equipment racks, communications hardware, signal monitoring panels, environmental control interfaces, and rows of status indicators blinking in slow rhythms. 2 Vreth technicians were at the far end of the room with their backs completely turned, focused on something on a lower panel that had their full attention. Tomas scanned the nearest equipment rack from the doorway. He found the short-range emergency broadcast unit in 40 seconds. It was mounted at chest height on the second rack, a compact panel with a frequency selector, a toggle switch, a small input pad, and a status light. He had seen one identical to it mounted on the wall of the Academy classroom back on Helix Station. He recognized the layout without any hesitation. He slipped through the door gap, kept low, moved to the rack, and crouched in front of the panel. He set the frequency selector to the Terran Coalition emergency band, 1 click left from the neutral position, the same as the classroom unit. He held Mara's coded paper up close and entered the number sequence on the input pad with careful, deliberate presses. He checked it once against the paper. Then he activated the transmit toggle. The unit sent its signal for 4 seconds, a number he counted in his head while watching the status light blink. Then he closed the toggle, stood. They moved back to the door gap and was inside the shaft before either technician turned around. The return journey took 9 minutes. When Tomas crawled back through the ventilation grill and stood up in the common room, his knees had long scrape marks on them, and there was a gray dust streak across one cheek, and his hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from the particular physical trembling that happens when a body has been very tightly focused for a long time, and the focus suddenly releases. Mara looked at him. "Done," he said. Mara replaced the grill carefully, pressed both clips back into their locked positions, and went to sit on her bunk. She placed the food wrapper maps in a neat stack and sat quietly, thinking about what would happen next and in what order. On the Vreth command ship, the signals officer detected the 4-second transmission at 11 minutes after the fact. It had originated from within Cage Station Omicron itself, from the environmental control level, and had been sent on a Terran Coalition emergency frequency. The encoding pattern was unfamiliar to Vreth signals analysis. It was not a standard military cipher. It was not a diplomatic code. The analysts could not match it to any known Vreth intelligence classification. It had a structure that resembled a mathematical puzzle rather than a professional encoding system. The alert arrived on Ka-Reth's screen while he was in a strategy session with his senior staff. He dismissed everyone immediately and stood alone in the command room, reading the full report 3 times. Then he understood what he was looking at, and the understanding arrived with the specific, irreversible weight of something that cannot be undone. A child had crawled through his station's maintenance shaft with a paper full of numbers in a children's code and transmitted their exact location to the Terran Coalition fleet. He opened a channel to Omicron in the same breath as the thought formed. The response came back in seconds. Cell block secure, all children present, nothing disturbed, no breaches detected. All 47 were right where they were supposed to be. But the signal had already gone. Sub-Commander Vale entered the command room without being called. He had seen the alert on his own monitoring panel. He stood next to Ka-Reth and read the same report without speaking. Then they both looked at the tactical display showing the Terran fleet positions at the outer sensor perimeter. The fleet had stopped its slow convergence. It had jumped. The Terran warships were no longer holding at the perimeter. They were incoming at full combat speed, and their navigational coordinates matched Cage Station Omicron with exact and perfect precision. Vale looked at Ka-Reth, and he chose not to soften what he said next, because there was no version of it that was softer. "Sir," he said carefully, "we did not take hostages." He let that sit for a moment. "We handed them a beacon," he said, "operated by a 10-year-old. Ka-Reth did not respond. He stood at the tactical display and watched the incoming fleet signatures multiply. And then for the first time in 30 years of military command, he had nothing left to say and no move left to make that changed anything. Later that evening, a cultural scholar named Pav, a small, elderly Vreth who had spent decades studying human civilization and had been traveling aboard the command ship for academic research, was brought to Ka-Reth's room at his direct personal request. Ka-Reth asked him one question. What do humans teach their children? Pav folded his hands and was quiet for only a brief moment before he answered. "Everything, General," he said. "Every story humans tell their young has the same fundamental shape. A small and ordinary person faces an overwhelming problem with no obvious solution and no powerful allies, and through cleverness and refusal to accept defeat, they win." He paused. "Humans do not shield their children from the idea of being in danger. And they do not protect the young from imagining themselves alone against something much larger than themselves." He looked at Ka-Reth directly. "They train them on it, sir. From the moment their children are old enough to follow a story, they have been teaching them what to do in exactly this kind of situation." Ka-Reth was silent. Pav added quietly and without any dramatism. "The last part. In every single one of those stories, the General, the overwhelming enemy loses." Ka-Reth sat with that information for a long time, alone in his command room, while the fleet signatures on his tactical display moved closer and closer to a station where 47 human children sat calmly waiting for the people who were coming to bring them home. Did they capture human children? The Alien General, Falters Part 5, The Reckoning. The Terran Coalition fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel around Cage Station Omicron at 0347 station time, and the battle that followed was not a long one. 32 warships came out of FTL in a tight encircling formation, a pattern the Vreth themselves had invented and called the Iron Ring, which was an irony that no one had time to appreciate at that moment. And every Vreth exit route from the station was covered. Every weapons emplacement on Omicron was targeted simultaneously by at least 2 coalition ships. The station's outer defense guns fired for 11 minutes, and then went silent one by one as their power connections were cut by precise, unhurried long-range fire from vessels that were in no particular rush, because they were in no particular danger. The Vreth garrison on Omicron had fewer than 400 soldiers. The coalition boarding teams had over 2,000. The engagement lasted 90 minutes. General Ka-Reth, watching from his command ship positioned at the edge of the system, made no attempt to counterattack. His warships were present, but they were not configured for the kind of close engagement that rescuing the station would require, and he was not willing to risk catastrophic damage to the structure while the children were still inside it. and he opened a channel to Coalition Command and requested terms for the garrison. Admiral Yara Osei took his call personally. She informed him in a voice of absolute professional composure that the garrison would be taken into custody under the full terms of interstellar laws of war, that all Vreth personnel would be treated accordingly, and that she expected his complete cooperation during the transfer process. And she informed him that she would be boarding Omicron personally, and that she expected no further military movement from his ships while she did so. Ka-Reth agreed to every condition without argument. He watched on his tactical display as Admiral Osei's flagship docked with the station, and then he sat down in his command chair and waited for whatever came next, because there was nothing else left for him to do. Inside the station, the cell block was the last section cleared. The boarding teams moved through Omicron in precise sequence: command deck, weapons systems, power core, docking bays, before turning their attention to the lower levels. Admiral Osei walked personally with the lead team, not because protocol required her to be at the front, but because there was nothing in any regulation that was going to make her stand in a corridor one deck away while someone else opened that door. The team officer reached the cell block entrance. He entered the override sequence and stepped back as the lock mechanism cycled through its release. The door opened. Mara was already standing in the doorway. She stood completely upright and composed, with her full stack of food wrapper maps held under one arm and both hands resting at her sides. Behind her, arranged in two organized rows sorted loosely by height, were 46 other children, all present, all looking at the open door with expressions that ranged from enormous and visible relief to a kind of quiet, steady readiness, as though they had been expecting this arrival and had spent the waiting time preparing for it. Admiral Osei crossed the threshold, and her composure, which had held without breaking through 6 days of crisis management, a fleet engagement, and 2 consecutive sleepless nights, lasted exactly until she was close enough to put both arms around her daughter. Though she held Mara for a long moment without saying anything. Mara allowed this for several seconds. Then she said, against her mother's shoulder in a calm and practical voice, "I need to brief you on the station layout. I have complete maps of all accessible sections, and there are at least 2 structural weaknesses in the lower power relay system that your engineers need to know about before they start working down there." Admiral Osei pulled back and looked at her daughter's face. Mara held up the food wrapper maps. There was a brief silence from the boarding team assembled in the corridor behind the Admiral. Then the team officer, a veteran soldier with 20 years of active service and a face that had seen a great deal, made a sound that was somewhere between a short laugh and something considerably more complicated than a laugh. He was not the only one. The processing of the garrison went smoothly and without incident. The Vreth soldiers were disarmed, moved to holding areas aboard coalition vessels, and treated correctly and without cruelty. The children were escorted to medical facilities on the Admiral's flagship for full assessment. All 47 healthy, all alert, all completely unharmed, every single one of them. Tomas walked past the garrison holding area on the way to the medical deck and stopped when he recognized Grumble standing in the prisoner group near the door. He said goodbye in Vreth, and with the correct throat sound on the farewell word, because he had learned it specifically for this purpose after Mara told him they would be leaving soon. Grumble went completely still for a moment. Then he raised one large gray-green hand in the gesture that Tomas had learned during 10 days of careful study was the Vreth equivalent of a wave goodbye. Tomas waved back. 2 Vreth soldiers standing nearby looked at each other with an expression that neither of them had language for. The Pip walked past the same moment, his mass of red curls bouncing and his repaired piece of maintenance equipment tucked firmly under his arm, because he had found it, fixed it with his own hands, and he had absolutely no intention of leaving it behind. He informed Tomas, without breaking stride, that this had been the best adventure he had ever had, and that he fully intended to write a detailed account of it for his Academy submission when they got back. Tomas told him it would probably get a very high mark. 2 days after the battle, General Kareth requested a formal communication channel. Admiral Osei received the call from the bridge of her flagship, surrounded by her command staff, with the recovered children settled into temporary quarters, one deck, directly below her feet. Kareth looked older than he had looked before the operation. It was not physical aging. 11 days was not enough for that. It was the particular quality of tiredness that settles into a person when they understand that they have been wrong about something deep, and that the wrongness goes far beneath any single decision they made. He requested terms for a ceasefire. Admiral Osei looked at him across the communication channel for a long, measured moment. Then she spoke. "General Kareth, you attempted to use our children as instruments of pressure against us," she said. They chose to use themselves as instruments of something else entirely. She kept her voice level and even, without coldness and without heat, simply factual. "Terms will be discussed through the appropriate diplomatic channels beginning today." She leaned forward slightly in her chair. "But understand something clearly. You have shown the rest of the galaxy something today. Every species watching this war has now seen what humans teach their children, and what those children do with it when the situation calls for it." She closed the channel. The ceasefire negotiations began within the week. They were long, detailed, and occasionally difficult, as all genuine negotiations are. At their conclusion, the final terms favored the Terran coalition on every significant point. The disputed border corridor remained under full coalition jurisdiction. The 3 outer colony sectors were confirmed as permanent Terran territory. The Vreth military withdrew from the contested border region entirely and accepted a monitored, demilitarized zone on their side of the boundary. Kareth resigned his command 6 weeks after the ceasefire agreement was signed. He issued no public statement. He simply submitted his resignation and stopped being a general. Mara Osei returned to the Starward Academy, relocated to a different station with significantly upgraded security systems and protocols. Mara reviewed the full security plan personally when it was presented to her and returned it with 3 pages of annotated suggestions for additional improvements. The security director accepted every single one of them. A journalist traveling on the same transport vessel as the Academy students asked Mara, during a quiet moment in the ship's common area, whether she had been afraid during those 11 days on Omicron. Mara thought about the question with genuine care, and the way she thought about all questions that deserved a real answer. "On the first night," she said, "but then there were things to figure out and things to do, so I focused on those instead." The journalist wrote this down carefully and did not ask a follow-up question because there was nothing useful to add to it. Weeks after the ceasefire was finalized, Subcommander Vale sat at his desk and worked through the formal after-action report that military procedure required of every senior officer following a significant engagement. The document moved through a standard set of sections: the initial operation, the tactical decisions, the series of events, and the final outcome. The last section asked him to identify the primary tactical error, the single most fundamental mistake that had led to the result. But Vale stopped at that section and sat for a while. He thought about Mara walking through the open cell block door with maps under her arm and the calm face of someone who had finished one task and was ready for the next. He thought about Tomas waving goodbye to a Vreth guard in correct Vreth with the right sound on the farewell word, a language he had learned in 10 days from a food wrapper and a broken piece of plastic. Not he thought about Pip walking away with his repaired equipment and his plans for an academy submission, looking for all the world like someone who had spent 11 days on an interesting field trip. He thought about the security feed image from the very first hour. 47 children in gray and blue uniforms gathered in the corner of a bright room, looking directly at the camera with wide and perfectly steady eyes. He put his writing tool to the page. But he wrote the only answer that was accurate. and the only answer that was honest, and the only answer that any future Vreth military planner would ever need to read in order to understand everything. We forgot what the enemy was. He submitted the report, closed his terminal, and sat for a moment in the quiet of his quarters. Outside his window, the stars held their positions in the dark, steady and indifferent the way they always were, indifferent to wars and to mistakes, and to the very specific lesson that the Vreth military had just paid an enormous price to learn about a species that raised its children on stories about small, ordinary people who faced impossible problems and refused to lose. Every single one of those stories ended the same way. The Vreth had simply never thought to ask why.